So before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about the EMV Migration Forum, which is hosting today's webinar. The EMV Migration Forum is a cross-industry body made up of organizations in the payments industry focused on supporting the implementation steps for EMV adoption in the U.S. among the global and regional networks, issuers, processors, merchants, and consumers to ensure that a successful migration to EMV chip technology happens. The focus of our organization is on those issues that require broad cooperation and coordination to complete this migration to EMV successfully in a timely and efficient manner. And for more information about the EMV Migration Forum, you can visit the website and the link that's on your screen today. Next slide. So the main purpose for this webinar, organized by the members of the Communication and Education Working Committee, with the help from the EMV Migration Forum Steering Committee, is to address the education needs for the entire payments industry. It's important that consumers receive consistent, accurate messages about their new chip cards and new ways for paying in retail stores. This webinar will enable executives to build sound communication strategies to help the U.S. market better understand and embrace chip payments and many security benefits it offers. The webinar is being recorded and again will be made available after the event on the EMV Connection website. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Again, I'll begin with myself. I'm Randy Vanderhoof. I'm the director of the EMV Migration Forum, and I also serve as the executive director of the Smart Card Alliance organization. I will begin with a brief introduction about the U.S. migration, and then I'll be handing off to our next presenter, Brady Cullimore, who's director of U.S. EMV Project Management Office at American Express. And Brady will be followed by Cynthia Knowles, Vice President for Market Integration for North American Card Solutions at FIS organization. And we have a special guest today, Eric Rainsford, Senior Manager for Multi-Channel Strategy and Development with Macy's organization, who will not be presenting but will be available to address any questions which may come up during today's webinar during the Q&A session that a merchant might be able to answer. Next slide. So let me begin with just a brief overview of the agenda, and then I will hand over the discussion to, the agenda and a overview of the U.S. chip migration. And then I'm going to hand over controls to Brady Cullimore from American Express, who will discuss the value of clear communications when it comes to issues involving EMV chip technology. Brady will then transition things to Cynthia Knowles from FIS, who will share some of the Communications and Education Working Committee's beliefs about the best practices and communications tools we believe will be effective for communications about EMV chip technology. I'll return at the end of the presentations to take your questions. I encourage you that, to put all questions into the questions toolbar in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be visible on your screen today, in addition to today's slide presentation that we'll be speaking from. And I'd encourage you to please submit your questions during the webinar rather than waiting until the very end so that we have time to see the questions and prioritize them in the limited time that we'll have at the end for today's webinar. Next slide, please. So let's get started with an overview of where we stand with the U.S. chip migration and share some context about how this mature technology has been implemented elsewhere and around the world. I'm going to begin by stating that the EMV technology is a security specification for payments. That specification, when it was written, was first applied to payment cards and payment terminals, which was the norm at the time. However, this security specification has been adopted to other methods of payments, such as mobile phones, phone-based point-of-sale terminals, and others, so that there's no controversy around the U.S. adopting a technology that's outdated, since security specifications in the EMV standards continue to evolve and be applied with existing card form factors as well as the new methods of transacting, such as using contactless technology, mobile NFC technology, and payments involving cloud services. So on the next slide, we're going to look at what global EMV chip market looks like and the state of the U.S. migration relative to the size of the total U.S. market. So on this chart that was supplied by EMVCo, it shows that there are a total of about 2.4 billion EMV chip cards that are in the market. The adoption rate for EMV cards, though, even in mature EMV markets, varies from a low of 24% in Europe Zone 2, which is primarily Eastern Europe, to a high of 81.6% in Europe Zone 1, which is in the Western European states. Asia Pacific is the lowest percentage at 17%, but that's because China's card population is now being counted in this region, and they are, like the U.S., just starting out in their EMV migration. So that represents a large number of cards that have yet to be replaced in the market there. EMV terminals are typically higher in all markets than are the percentages of EMV cards. And that's mostly because there are far fewer terminals than cards, and in most other markets other than the United States, the issuing banks also own the terminals, so banks are more likely to put the EMV terminals in even before they've started issuing all of their cards as EMV cards. You'll note that in that upper chart that the U.S. is excluded currently from these EMVCo market figures, and that should change next year. We've taken an attempt to try to fill in the missing data there on the U.S. market. So a very quick peek of the current U.S. EMV adoption figures are in the chart below this, and it obviously tells a very different story. And these are unofficial numbers. We estimate that at the end of 2013, there were about 17 to 20 million cards in the market in the U.S. that were EMV chip enabled, which represents roughly 2% of the total card population of 1 billion cards. EMV terminals were slightly better in percentage-wise at about 20% of the terminals in the market have been upgraded to support EMV chip technology, about 2 million of those. But as you can see, we still have quite a long way to go to reach full adoption, as have other regions of the country. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why the U.S. market is adopting chip technology and why they're doing it now. The first thing is that security as a way to reduce counterfeit card fraud is one of the drivers for moving EMV now. EMV has been proven in other markets to dramatically reduce counterfeit card fraud by as much as 67%. And it supports additional security features such as offline PIN, which has been shown to be effective at reducing lost and stolen card fraud. Also, there are two ways in which EMV is more secure. One, that it's the secure storage of the payment data in the chip rather than on the magnetic stripe makes EMV cards difficult to make counterfeit copies of. And secondly, that the chip creates a one-time dynamic code each time the chip is used in a transaction, so that the dynamic data prevents criminals from using that data to make fraudulent transactions or usable copies of either the EMV chip cards or the magnetic stripe cards. Fraud will migrate to the weakest link, which is why it requires both the cards and the terminals to be equipped with EMV, or else the fraud will not be abated. And since the U.S. is the last major market to move to EMV, we've been seeing an increase in fraud from other countries into the United States, which makes the situation even worse until the U.S. migrates. Another driver for EMV is global interoperability among payment cards. And U.S. travelers have become increasingly disadvantaged when they try to use their magnetic stripe cards in markets that already accept EMV chip cards. Having a card rejected is bad for the U.S. consumer, bad for the U.S. issuer, and the merchant who serviced that U.S. customer abroad is not going to be pleased as well. Without global interoperability at the chip level, the magnetic stripe becomes the lowest and weakest common denominator. It will be far safer in the U.S. when foreign visitors can use their EMV chip cards in the U.S. as well. A third driver for EMV is that it modernizes the payments ecosystem and enables newer payments technologies such as mobile payments and cloud payments to be supported, built on a more secure and expandable U.S. payments network. The major brands that serve the U.S. market are advancing the rate of U.S. adoption with a series of incentives, as well as a shift in the liability policies, which rewards the most secure party in the transaction by passing the fraud risk to the least secure party, with the expectation that fraud will significantly be removed from the U.S. market when both parties are actively enabling the security technology. Next slide. So let me summarize exactly how EMV chip data protects against card-present or in-person counterfeit card fraud. First, the embedded microprocessor in the card or the phone, excuse me, lost my voice. A little bit better. The embedded microprocessor in the card or in the phone has proven security defenses that prevent tampering with the card data. The chip provides secure storage for the card data compared to the less secure and easily copied magnetic stripe. I'm sorry. And during the chip payments transaction, dynamic data is generated and transmitted through the terminal and processing network, which verifies the authenticity of the transaction. And this eliminates the possibility that this data can be intercepted or used to make another fraudulent mag stripe or chip card transaction, thus greatly reducing the value of this data for criminals looking to commit payment card fraud. The chip-enabled terminals that detect that the card has the secure chip on it, if it's swiped as a magnetic stripe card at the terminal, and the terminals will direct the cardholder to use the more secure chip to complete the payments transaction instead. So these and other security features built into the EMV specification ensure greater security while maintaining interoperability for chip payments around the globe. Next slide. So this is just a representation of what a magnetic stripe may look like in terms of the encoded data on the card. And this shows that the data would be easily read and replicated by criminals with only simple counterfeiting devices and encoders. The valuable card data that's present is static, not protected, and really not hidden by any security measures. The next slide. And comparing that to the chip data stored inside the chip, it would look like a series of binary numbers which represent the codes for the card data that resides in the chip memory. Although the data is not encrypted, if the data was copied and programmed into another chip card, the secret issuer keys associated with that card when it was issued would not match the duplicate chip card, and the transaction would be rejected. Next slide. So although many other regions have already implemented EMV, including nearby Europe, United Kingdom, Canada, and Mexico, the U.S. payments market is unique, and how EMV gets implemented here will be specific to the unique aspects of the U.S. payments market. For example, in the U.S. there are 2 international and 16 regional debit networks that need to be supported by the EMV technology. Also, there's the Durbin Amendment, which is a regulatory requirement governing how debit cards are issued and how merchants can choose which debit application on the card is used, has added another level of complexity for both issuers of the cards as well as the acquirers and processors of EMV debit transactions that needed to be accounted for. And since the U.S. is the largest number of issuers and merchants enabled for card payment transactions in the world, this also adds an additional layer of complexity to get all parties to be moving in a coordinated fashion. Next slide. So that concludes my overview of the U.S. EMV migration market, and now we're going to talk about what the value of clear communications to help facilitate that migration even faster will be in the future. So let me hand things over now to Brady Cullimore from American Express, who will discuss the value of clear communications. Brady?
Thank you, Randy. First, I think we can all agree that customers today want more. They want greater freedom to make payments how, where, and when they want, but they also want greater security. You can go to the next slide. Historically, there's been a trade-off between greater freedom and greater security. A payment method which provides for a lot of freedom and flexibility has been inherently less secure, and payment methods that are more secure require a reduction in flexibility. So what EMV seeks to do is to increase both the freedom and the security of payments. So in that case, where is the trade-off? I believe that the trade-off is that the EMV co-specification has the potential to be confusing, and the chip card implementation in a new market, especially one as complex as the U.S., can be complex and challenging. So the burden rests on us as communicators and content creators to help bring clarity and reduce confusion in the U.S. for cardholders, merchants, and all stakeholder groups in the U.S. payments ecosystem. Let's focus first on the cardholder perspective. This is a very broad group with constituents across the spectrum of knowledge, understanding, and interest in the chip card migration and payments in general. Some of the questions from this group include, how do I get a chip card? When do I use a PIN or a signature? Where can I use my chip card? These are just a few of the questions that we've heard from these cardholders. So spend some time understanding this perspective as you create your content about the chip card migration. Think about your audience and the questions they are asking, and make sure that you're communicating clearly to your audience, whatever their level of sophistication may be. So now let's shift gears and consider the merchant perspective, which includes customer-facing merchant representatives like store clerks. First, there are many different types of merchants in this category, from mom-and-pop shop owners to clerks at large retail stores to servers at restaurants, and many in between. Again, they each have unique perspectives on the chip card migration. Some of the questions from this group include, how will I know when a customer needs to swipe or insert a card? What is EMV? Why should I upgrade to accept chip cards? What are the benefits of accepting chip cards? Again, these are just a few of the questions coming from this stakeholder group, so keep this perspective in mind if you are creating content for merchants. Those of us that work on the U.S. chip card migration on a daily basis have read hundreds of articles from hundreds of different resources representing many perspectives. And because there are so many nuances to the U.S. chip card migration, it is difficult to find an article that is 100% correct in its assumptions, its use of terminology, and in the factual statements that it makes. I want to share a couple of examples with you of articles pulled from the internet which contain some inaccurate information that is worth reviewing. So this first one reads, every credit card in the U.S. will be replaced by October 2015 with new cards that contain the chip and PIN technology that the rest of the world has had for years, ... There are two things I want to call out in this article. First, it states that every credit card in the U.S. will be replaced by October 2015, and this is not an accurate statement. Each issuer has its own roadmap, and many credit cards will be issued by that date, but many will be issued after that date as well. And second, it states that all credit cards will be issued with chip and PIN technology, which is also not accurate. Chip and PIN is only one verification method allowed within the EMV specification, and each card issuer decides which verification methods it will utilize, and not all issuers are choosing to utilize chip and PIN. So the way that we recommend communicating this same information is to leverage text, which is made available through the EMV Migration Forum website that Randy referred to earlier. There's a press room section where there are snippets you can copy and paste into your own articles or communication. You can even use the information without citing the source, which is an attempt to standardize the way we are communicating information to U.S. consumers. So the way we recommend conveying the same information is there on your screen. I'll read only the second paragraph there. Throughout this year, consumers should start receiving their new chip cards, and by 2015, we'll be able to use them more frequently to pay at retail outlets. So the next example that I'm going to share says that chip and PIN cards, often referred to as EMV cards due to the common standards for technology created by Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, have gained popularity because the cardholder data stored on the chip is encrypted and the cards are almost impossible to duplicate. First, this article implies that chip and PIN cards are synonymous with EMV cards. I already spoke about this a little bit, the fact that PIN is simply a verification method within EMV, so they're not the same thing. The terms are not interchangeable. And second, it states that cardholder data stored on the chip is encrypted, which is technically not true. without getting into the technical details of EMV, the language from the press room, which I referred to earlier on the EMV Migration Forum website, states accurately that EMV chip cards contain secure computer chips that validate the authenticity of the card and include a one-time use security code in every transaction, making chip payment data virtually impossible to use for counterfeit card fraud. Again, that language is available for your use. I want to take a look in the next slide at the ecosystem involved in the U.S. chip card migration. The cardholder is pictured here in the middle, and the cardholder wants to pay or access money in a variety of ways: ATM, mobile devices, online or e-commerce transactions, offline transactions, which might exist in transit or vending environments, and of course at point-of-sale terminals. There are many players involved in making this variety of payment methods possible for the cardholder. A few of them are listed here. There are many others not listed here, but this at least communicates that a lot of stakeholder groups are involved in moving a market towards chip card use. As shown here, the federal government is one of them. We have representatives from the Federal Reserve at most or all of our in-person EMV Migration Forum meetings, and they are participating so they can obtain firsthand knowledge about what is going on in the U.S. payments ecosystem. Our hope is that we can communicate effectively as an industry and work together to enable a smooth chip card migration for all the stakeholder groups in the U.S. So I want to walk through a possible scenario of an everyday cardholder to convey some of the potential experiences a cardholder might face during this chip card migration. And this is just one of literally millions of experiences that will exist. But let's say that an envelope arrives in the mail one day with a replacement credit card. Upon opening the envelope, the cardholder reads an insert which talks about a chip on the card that enables a more secure transaction. The cardholder notes the card still has a mag stripe, and she calls to activate the card. Later that day, while out running errands, the cardholder goes to submit payment using her chip card. She finds the chip slot on the terminal and inserts it, and nothing happens. The clerk is confused about why the cardholder isn't swiping her card, so she proceeds to swipe her mag stripe, completing the transaction, which she continues to do from that day forward. So now we'll fast forward a couple of months. The cardholder walks into her regular grocery store near her house. This time, when she swipes her card, the terminal beeps, and she is prompted to insert her card. She recalls that her card has a chip. She begins looking around the terminal for a place to insert her card. The store clerk recognizes the cardholder's momentary confusion and directs the cardholder to insert her chip into the reader on the front of the terminal. The cardholder follows the clerk's instructions, confirms the total purchase amount, and waits. At this stage, the cardholder might be required to verify herself through a signature or a PIN. If the card is a chip and PIN card, will the cardholder remember the PIN she received in the mail a couple of months ago, possibly a PIN she did not choose for herself? If the card is a chip and signature card, the cardholder will sign her signature on either the receipt or an electronic signature pad. The cardholder leaves the store, having had a new experience which was hopefully made easier through the use of clear communication from a variety of sources, including first, her issuer upon receipt of her chip card, second, messaging on the point-of-sale device, third, a small amount of assistance from the store clerk, and hopefully fourth, through news articles or news reports about chip cards. So the cardholder continues to use the magstripe functionality on her card at the majority of merchant locations, but she knows that when she goes to her grocery store, she will be using the chip on her card to complete the transaction. So over the next year or two, the cardholder will receive additional chip cards and will use them as prompted by the terminal, with some assistance from her issuers and a little assistance from store clerks who have been made aware that terminals in his or her store location have become chip-enabled. So I want to highlight a couple of experiences to which you'll want to give some extra sensitivity as you create your communication pieces. At restaurants in markets that are broadly chip-enabled, portable terminals are brought to the table so the cardholders complete the transaction at the table without ever giving their card to the server. Also, at the time of the transaction, the transaction is sent to the issuer for approval, the entire amount of the transaction must be known. So the cardholders will select the amount of the tip prior to submitting the payment, which is different than today's magstripe environment in the U.S. Looking at ATM machines, they must be updated across the U.S. to be able to support chip cards, and this is a very time-consuming and costly endeavor for ATM owners. And chip card migration for automated fuel dispensers or gas stations will also be very costly and time-consuming. Some gas pumps have proprietary payment solutions built into their machines, which are expensive to upgrade. In some cases, gas station owners need to literally break the concrete to run new wires capable of supporting the extra data requirements for chip card transactions. So what we want to propose today is a simple framework that we've developed for you to consider as you build your communication pieces, whatever your role may be. First, please be sure that you're relying on accurate assumptions and that you're stating accurate facts in your communication. Second, please make an effort to be consistent in your use of terminology, both within your communication but also within your organizations and across the industry. The EMV Migration Forum has over 150 member organizations. However, we are able to communicate with each other clearly because we have standardized our terminology and statements of fact. Third, please make sure your communication is relevant and timely. The U.S. chip card migration is moving so quickly, there is some kind of new announcement from someone in the ecosystem with respect to chip cards on a weekly and sometimes daily basis. When an announcement is made by an organization about their U.S. chip card migration plans, ripple effects can occur in other parts of the ecosystem, which should be understood so that your communication will increase the clarity, not the confusion within the industry. And last, make sure that you know your audience. You will communicate differently to a merchant than you might to a cardholder, or you might communicate differently to an international traveler versus a non-traveler, or a debit card holder versus a credit card holder, and so forth. I'm going to turn the time over to Cindy now to walk you through some really great tools that will help you work within the communication framework that we've proposed for you. Cindy?
Great. Thank you, Brady. For the next few minutes, I will be sharing with you the tools and best practices available through the Forum's Communication and Education Working Committee. The committee is comprised of many contributors across the payments ecosystem that Brady mentioned earlier. And through collaboration and other global experiences, we've created a number of useful tools that will help and guide you through the communication and education process. Many of these tools are completed. Some are still fluid as we all gain additional education surrounding the migration to chip technology. So let's move to the next slide, and I'll talk about one of the tools that has been created and will be available for stakeholders to use. One of the first early efforts was the building of the Standardization of Terminology document. This was launched in the middle of 2013, and in January of this year, we updated the document. Again, since chip migration has been an evolving learning process for us all, we believed it to be very important to update these findings on a semi-annual basis. The document contains terms and definitions that are related to chip migration, and it provides the industry term, AKAs, the industry or stakeholder definition, and where applicable, it also describes a cardholder or consumer definition that we can use in your messaging. We highly encourage all stakeholders to reference this document as it will improve and it lends itself to consistent use of terms and definitions across the payments ecosystem. So going on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the top chip terms. As Brady previously mentioned in his section, the consistent and the correct use of terms will be critical in every piece of communication. On this slide, we share some examples of top chip terms, what to use in the green column versus what to avoid in the red column. And if we look at the green column, chip card or EMV chip card when used for the first time is the preferred term to use, and you should avoid using smart card as this has many definitions. In addition, avoid using chip and pin as a generic description. As referenced earlier from Brady, U.S. issuers are pretty much chip and choice, meaning the issuer will decide if their card will be chip and pin or chip and signature when they issue it out to their cardholders. The next example down is insert your card versus dip your card. The dip was a popular phrase in the UK, and it's not really being adopted in the US, as you'll see through this presentation. And what we're advising issuers is to be consistent in using the word insert your card. So as we move to the next slide, I'll share another example. Here we define the difference between chip-capable versus chip-enabled terminals. Many terminals may already have the chip slot in the terminal, meaning it is chip-capable. However, it's not until the software is enabled that the terminal will be able to accept the chip card and authorize the transaction. So as you're out there in the marketplace and you go shopping, you'll see these terminals, and you'll see that the insert or the slit where the card can be inserted. And it's not to say that it's enabled yet, but it is capable, and when the merchant's ready to turn on that functionality, then the chip card will be able to be utilized at the point of sale. On to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about cardholder education and another tool that we've completed. Last summer, we launched and finished the Who Educates Whom project. And what we did was a full analysis of the complete payments ecosystem and the relationships between all the stakeholders. We came up with 14 diagrams in a document that provide excellent illustrations as to who has the obligation or recommendation of providing education to each other, and eventually down to the cardholder or the consumer. So what I'm going to do is the next couple of slides, I'm going to run through examples of what we're talking about. And the first example is who has the obligation in educating the cardholder. So this example from the cardholder perspective, as you can see, there are a number of players that have a role in communicating to the cardholder. The card issuer has the responsibility of providing chip awareness, usage instructions, FAQs, terminal placement or ATM locators. The merchant should be providing assistance at the point of sale and instructions at the point of sale. Payment networks and the industry organizations will be providing high-level chip awareness campaigns. And the POS and ATM operators will provide instructions at the ATM or the point of sale with helpful terminal messaging and prompts to guide the cardholder through the transaction process. We also have available a YouTube tutorial as to how to use this tool, and that's on the forum's EMV-Connections.com website, something very useful. So again, we have 14 different diagrams of the different stakeholders representing within the ecosystem with similar sorts of diagrams as to who has the responsibility. The next example and slide, I'll share with you the merchant perspective. And this happens to be for a Tier 3 or 4 merchant, meaning your mid to small-sized merchant locations or chains. And as you can see, there are a number of players that the merchant will be relying on for education. So if you are a merchant and you're listening in today, you really should be reaching out to your partners and your vendors for education and information, as well as reaching out to the EMV Migration Forum for the tools and best practices and messaging that will help you guide your consumers and your sales associates through the migration process. On to the next slide, we'll take a look at the Knowledge Center that is under development. So if you've been involved with chip migration over the past 12 to 18 months, you know that there is a lot of information available, from historical documentation from other countries to industry white papers, press releases, FAQs, and much, much more. So what we did is create a simple organizational tool that will help you navigate to the topic you're seeking information. And this is also housed on the EMV Migration Forum website under the EMV-Connections.com. As we move to the next slide, I'll show a snippet of the Knowledge Center. With nearly 200 vetted links pointing to industry documents, the Knowledge Center is organized by several categories that you will see in the green box on the screen. And you'll be able to filter your search by testing and certification, customer experience, regulation and compliance, implementing an EMV. As you can see, they're listed with a number of different filters. And this is going to be a great tool for merchants, issuers, acquirers, processors, networks, literally every member of the payments ecosystem. And it's very simple to use. That it's basically an Excel file that allows you to navigate and filter by clicking on the category of topic and the stakeholder group that you're interested in, and then you'll go to the link. Again, the links will take you to white papers, industry announcements, best practices, and FAQs and other sorts of documentation. It'll be very, very helpful. Again, it's one repository of information that you can go to that will be updated on a semi-annual basis. So let's move to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about messaging. We are now in a deep dive into our messaging project, which is coming near completion, and we believe it's going to have the most value for issuers and merchants. As indicated earlier in the presentation, as a cardholder, we will all have varying experiences surrounding our own migration to chip card use. And if we open up our own wallets, we may have cards from different providers, and therefore our own education and our own experiences are going to be different. So to address this, we're putting together another user-friendly tool that will help issuers and merchants understand the different phases of chip migration. And as you see in the example, there's 3 phases. There's before the card is issued or before issuance, as the card is issued or at issuance, and after the card has been issued or sent, or the post-issuance phase. This particular slide is from an issuer's perspective, so again, the consistent and repetitive use of the standardized terms through all the channels and all the mediums used are going to be very, very important to ensure a seamless and efficient migration experience. In addition to educating your cardholders, issuers will also need to go through extensive training and education within your own organizations, such as your call centers, your IVRs, your branches, customer service centers, public relations, and so forth. So virtually every department that has a touch point with a cardholder or within internally or touching each other will need to get educated. So it's a major undertaking, and if you reflect on the Who Educates Whom diagram that I just went through, again, leaning on your partners to help you through this process will be critical. The next slide we move to is messaging from a merchant perspective. And again, it goes without saying that consistent and repetitive education and training and messaging will be imperative across all the channels and touch points, not only to your customers who walk into your store locations or your restaurant locations, but also to your sales associates. The larger your organization, the more need for training and education. And with turnover and new and seasonal type of things going on, merchants really need to have a sound educational process in place for training their colleagues. And just like an issuer, this is a major undertaking. And if you reflect back upon the Who Educates Whom diagram, leaning on your partners to help you through this process is going to be essential. So the last slide on messaging is going to share with how we're transforming the previous diagrams into a useful infographic. Whether you are a merchant or an issuer, you're going to be able to click through the infographic to glean helpful direction and messaging with example materials to consider during your migration efforts. This tool is expected to be completed by mid-3rd quarter, so look for announcements from the forum in the very near future. And again, the committee responsible for this tool and all the tools that I've shared with you today comprises multiple members from the payments ecosystem. So we have issuers, we have merchants, processors, networks, acquirers, hardware manufacturers, and so much more that have contributed to all the information that you've seen thus far in this webinar. And it really goes without saying, it literally takes a village to migrate the United States to chip cards. So with that, on to the next slide, I'm going to share a little bit of the resources available through the EMV Migration Forum. As you can see, there are a number of resources, the documents I just shared with you, as well as EMV-related white papers that were completed by many of the different forum committees. And so we're very proud of what we've accomplished in about a 12 to 18 month time frame of these documents that are available to you as a member of either the EMF or a stakeholder in the ecosystem. And there are more resources continued on the next slide. Again, doing simple Google searches and setting up alerts to receive regular updates is key in staying on top of what is happening. We move to the next slide, and I just need to reset my computer here. As we move to the next slide here, in order to tie things together as to what Brady spoke to, it's critical for you, regardless of what part of the ecosystem you represent, to have accurate, consistent, relevant and timely, and of course, knowing your audience as you develop messaging and communication to your customers, to your clients, and to your colleagues. But again, you're not alone, and as you know, there are plenty of resources available to help you and your organization navigate through the chip migration process. And if we move to the next slide, somehow it just all works out. And to steal a slide from a workshop we did and what a Canadian merchant did, don't forget to take your card. I think that that's probably one of the biggest learning lessons that many merchants across the globe have encountered is reminding the consumer to take the card after the card's been inserted into the terminal, because the terminal will keep the card until the transaction is over. So we hope this information has been valuable to you. And with that, we have a polling question that we would like to get some feedback on, and then we'll open it up for the chat room for your particular questions. And in addition, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have Eric Rainsberg from Macy's available to answer any merchant-related questions. So if you take a few minutes to answer the question, the quick poll that's in front of you, I will turn it back to Randy, and we'll begin to field questions through the chat room. Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Cynthia. So I'll just give people another few seconds to respond to the polling question. Okay, well, let's begin. I want to thank both Cynthia and Brady for their excellent review and content. And I noticed as the questions were coming in, some of those questions were actually answered further on in the presentation. So you were a little ahead of us, but that's good. I'm glad that you were thinking along with what we felt was important for you to learn and understand. The first question that I'd like to present and see if Brady would answer this. Visa has publicly advocated that they're in favor of chip and signature on their EMV cards. MasterCard has advocated for both chip and PIN and chip and signature. What is Amex and Discover advocating?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that, and I'll be responding to this from an American Express perspective, whereas the presentation is more from an EMV migration forum perspective. But I hear this question a lot, and it's targeted primarily at the American Express business as an issuer. And as you pointed out, all of the consumer and open American Express cards are currently available for chip and signature enablement. So if you have those cards in your wallet, you can call and request that chip to be put on your card. You'll be issued a new card with the chip. They do utilize chip and signature technology. The driver behind that was that's what we've heard in the market, is what our card members were looking for. What we're trying to create was a similar experience to the MagStripe experience. The U.S. is used to signing for its credit card purchases, and so we wanted to make the migration as simple as possible by enabling that same verification method in an EMV environment. If you remember, EMV, or the chip card specification, creates some really great security, whether it's chip and signature or chip and PIN, because of the card authentication capability. And so we're seeing really great security benefits through the chip and signature utilization. And in the future, it very likely will be utilizing chip and PIN technology. I can't say when that is exactly, but it's definitely something that we're watching very closely, and we're responding to the demand as we are seeing it. We have partners that issue American Express cards in the U.S., and a couple of them are issuing chip and PIN cards. So it's something that we're basically are telling issuers to do what they want. What we're doing as issuers ourselves is utilizing chip and signature at this stage. And I can't speak to Discover, so I won't attempt to cover that question.
Thank you, Brady. Cynthia, a question came up with regard to communications from an issuer. How can an issuer provide detailed usage instructions when the experience will be mainly dictated by the merchant, especially for debit cards?
Well, that's a good question. Again, as far as the issuer communicating to the cardholders, they need to rely on, again, consistent use of documentation and resources available to them. They need to be consistent with how they're communicating, how the card experience is going to be across the different channels and across the different mediums. And if the merchants situation is that they are a PIN-preferred merchant, the terminal is going to prompt the consumer through the process. So the consumer really doesn't have to worry too much as to what the experience is going to be at the point of sale. They'll be guided through that process through the prompts.
Great. Thank you, Thank you, Cynthia. There's a question, I think, from my presentation on the numbers. So just to clarify, when I said that the U.S. market had approximately 20% of the terminals that are EMV enabled, that does not mean that they are turned on and activated to accept EMV chip cards, but rather that the terminals are still are in place and ready for enablement as soon as the merchant decides to turn that system on, which will also be dictated by their acquirer having the software that runs on those terminals fully tested and operational at that time. So it will be a merchant-by-merchant decision as to when those terminals actually get activated. And as Cynthia, or Brady rather, mentioned in his discussion about the transaction flow, that the terminals will detect a magnetic stripe card that has a chip on it and will prompt the consumer to then insert the chip into the terminal when the terminal software is activated. So consumers don't have to worry about knowing whether the merchant is activated or not. If they swipe their card at the terminal, it'll tell them that the terminal is enabled to support chip, and if they insert their chip card in a terminal that's not ready, it will prompt them to swipe the mag stripe. So the message that we seem to want to emphasize here is that follow the guidance of the terminals and the terminal prompts, and they will generally lead you in the right direction. A question for Brady. Can you, the customer or the questioner wants a simple explanation for the level of security offered by a chip card that still has a magnetic stripe. I guess the concern is a card that's got a chip and a mag stripe a vulnerability. Can you respond to that?
I can attempt to do that, and I know, Randy, you provided some good descriptions to this in the past as well. But as you are aware, chip cards that are in the market today in the U.S. and really across the world still have a mag stripe. And it's true that a mag stripe data can be stolen from a chip card, and it could in fact be rewritten to a counterfeit card. But there's certain elements that are specific to the chip and that are specific to the mag stripe. For example, if you do a direct copy and paste mag stripe data from a legitimate card to a counterfeit card, when the fraudster goes to swipe that counterfeit card at a terminal, the terminal will recognize that data as a chip card, and it will say you'll need to insert your chip to complete this transaction. Of course, there's no chip on that card, and so the fraudster will not be able to complete the transaction in that case. That's, of course, in a case where a terminal is chip-enabled and is looking for the chip data. So that's why we encourage both the terminal upgrade to chip capability and enablement, as well as the chips being put onto the cards. It's a network technology that requires both the terminal and the chip to be enabled in order to recognize the full benefit. That's a kind of a simple explanation of it. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think that was a great, simple explanation, Brady. Thank you. Cynthia, is it accurate to say that while consumers are protected from liability in fraud, they are still unprotected from fraud overall if both the terminal and the card are not EMV equipped?
Well, I think that would be a safe assumption. I mean, if both parties aren't upgraded or chip enabled, then the potential of fraud or the mag stripe data being stolen and that card being utilized for fraudulent purposes are probably higher. And of course, it goes without saying that in the consumer not present area that it's also very vulnerable in that space.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you. A question that came in that I think I can answer. If a customer doesn't remember the PIN on their card, and by that I think we're referring to an offline PIN on a chip and PIN card, will they be able to bypass the PIN prompt from the merchant and process the transaction via signature? Are there different considerations between debit and credit? So this will be an option by the issuer and by the merchant in terms of whether or not they will enforce the PIN if the PIN is enabled on the card and the terminal is a PIN accepting terminal. But best practices would be that if you have a PIN enabled card, which is the highest level of security, you would want to enforce the PIN and not allow for the transaction to be processed without the PIN, because that does then open up that card for the possibility that someone has stolen that card and is using it without the authorization of the card holder. But it's something in the specifications that allow for a decision to be made both at the card level and at the terminal level to bypass that level of cardholder verification. But that would then have implications on who bears the liability if it turns out that that transaction was an unauthorized use of that card. So let me see if I can get another question or two in here before we have to leave.
Are there any merchant questions, Randy, for Eric?
I haven't seen one specifically for the merchants yet. I'm still looking for one, but good thought. Well, this one's for you, Cynthia, and it's probably a subjective question, but I think you're the best person to answer it. When is a good time to initiate discussions with consumers if you are an issuer?
Well, I would say that's the before phase, and I would say now. I think that it's very, very important for all issuers to begin laying out their project plans and their roadmaps as to how they're going to begin talking to their consumers and cardholders. Again, if you go back to the example that we all as consumers have multiple cards in our wallets, I would say that you would want to be first in communicating with your cardholders, so your cardholder knows that you're aware of what's happening, and just be out in front of the game. So now.
Okay. Brady, there's a question here about are there concerns for customers traveling abroad with being able to use their chip and signature card when that country accepts chip and PIN cards?
The experience that we've heard so far, and this is again from American Express perspective, has been very favorable. The majority of merchants in international markets, and UK, I'd say, is probably the most mature market, so I can refer to that, is they are primarily a PIN accepting market. However, the default EMV specification recommends that merchants accept signature cards as well. The card is still authenticated in that case, and most merchants by default will accept a signature card as well as a PIN card. The only time that would not be the case is if the merchant proactively blocks signature acceptance from their location, and in that case there would be a disruption, but we find that very, very rarely to be the case. Most merchants will accept the signature cards just fine. There are, of course, cases of unattended terminals in certain countries, primarily in the European region, and if it's an unattended terminal that requires a PIN to be used, then there will likely be a disruption there as well. Again, that's a very, very small percentage of terminals, and there are actually processes in place to help to smooth over that situation as well. But we do recognize there is a small amount of disruption internationally, but it's very, very slim.
Okay, and we do have a question for Eric. I hope he's still with us on the line today, but this is a big question for merchants as a whole. What do you think is the biggest challenge that will be for merchant perspectives to the chip adoption in the U.S.? Do you want to give that one a shot?
An open-ended question, but sure. So obviously the biggest challenge as a merchant is making sure that our customers have the least impact on the payment experience as possible. We can combat that, or we can make sure that the customers have this experience by making sure that our associates and our cashiers understand the process, and also we're able to help our customers as needed. By making them aware of this in a general aspect, and really focusing on prompting at point of sale, or enforcing or reinforcing the trusted terminal thought process. A lot of these terminals are built so that they prompt the customer through this process, and making sure cashiers are aware of that will help this process become more streamlined and help the customer through this process. I think personally, and as a merchant, we want to make sure our customers are impacted the least as possible, to make sure a quick payment, a convenient payment, and there's no concerns during that process.
Great. Thank you, Eric. And I think we have time for one more final question, and this question was asked in a couple of different ways, but we talked a lot about the benefits of fraud protection with EMV chip cards in a card-present environment, and people want to know what is being done to protect the card-not-present environment, or when people shop online, and does EMV provide any protections in that area? So I can say that from a general standpoint, since the chip is not involved in an online transaction, the security features on the chip are not enabled during that online payment transaction, and therefore EMV doesn't offer any additional levels of security. Within the U.S., the EMV migration forum is actively addressing the fact that we expect that fraud will migrate from the card-present channels to the card-not-present channels. And so rather than wait for that to happen, we are taking a proactive approach of meeting with industry stakeholders to discuss what we can do now to further protect the card-not-present or online payment channels with other techniques and other uses. And there are a number of solutions that are available on the market, and more that are coming. And so we expect that both merchants and issuers and processors will be actively engaged in looking at those other options while they are managing the card-present fraud issues with EMV, and see where they can find ways to avoid seeing the fraud simply migrate to another channel, but actually see fraud removed from the system entirely. Tokenization has been in the news recently as one of the technologies that are being looked at, and certainly it offers a lot of promise as a way to provide more security for online transactions. But we still have some ways to go yet before we have the standards in place and the operational aspects of tokenization in place to see whether that's going to have a significant impact on the market in the near term. So fortunately, we are up at the end of the hour today. We want to thank you all for your participation. We have available the resources that Kathy has been providing for you in the past on the slideshow. Here are some of the contributors to this webinar today. We'd like to thank all of these organizations for helping us put together the content for today's webinar. We genuinely thank all of you for your participation and your great questions today. And as a reminder, we will have the webinar available for replay and the presentation deck available shortly. And if you have registered for today's webinar, we will send you an email confirmation with the link and the details as soon as that's available. Thank you all for your time and attention today. Have a great day, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Goodbye.